A man reached into his bag, his hands trembling. Inside was something he'd carried for 40 years, through battlefields, across an ocean, through an entire career, a marriage, a whole life. He was about to hand it to a stranger he hadn't seen since that stranger was 9 years old. This is the story of a watch, a promise made in the middle of a war, and the boy who never forgot it. December 1966. Phil Seymour was 20 years old when his boots first touched Vietnamese soil. He didn't arrive as a tourist or a visitor. He arrived as a sergeant in the U.S. 1st Marine Division. His world, from that point on, was chaos. Firefights, patrols, the sound of helicopters cutting through humid skies day and night. But war is never just bullets and battles. It's also made of small, quiet hours in between. And it was in one of those quiet hours that Phil's story really begins. Stationed near Hội An, a river town in central Vietnam, known today as one of the most beautiful old towns in the country, Phil and his fellow Marines often crossed the river into town on their time off. The narrow streets were alive with children, their laughter rising above the tension that hung over everything else. Most of the kids came running the moment they saw the soldiers, not out of fear, but curiosity. They tugged at uniforms, asked for candy, begged for cans of meat. And the soldiers, young men themselves, far from home, found something like joy in giving. Among that lively crowd of children, one boy always stood apart. His name was Cam, about 9 years old, thin but strong, with a gaze that carried both shyness and pride. Unlike the others, Cam never begged. Instead, he showed up with offerings: bananas, coconuts, limes, a fair trade for a soldier's rations. That honesty, that quiet act of dignity, made him impossible to forget. Phil often noticed the boy hanging back, while the others scrambled for gifts. If Cam had nothing to trade that day, he simply smiled and watched from a distance. His presence was calm, almost grounding, in the middle of everything else going on around them. Then one afternoon in June 1967, Phil told Cam he was going on leave, a short trip to Thailand before heading back to duty. He crouched down to the boy's height and asked gently, "What would you like me to bring you back?" The boy hesitated. His English was limited. His whole world at that point was small, a river town, a war he didn't choose, soldiers who came and went. Then his eyes drifted to Phil's wrist. "The watch?" he said. Phil laughed. "When I come back," he told him, "it's yours." And he meant it. In Thailand, he found one, small, sturdy, exactly the kind of watch a 9-year-old boy would be proud to wear. He tucked it carefully into his gear, already picturing the moment he'd hand it over. But war doesn't care much for promises. By the time Phil returned from leave, the missions had changed. Orders were different. Circumstances pulled him further and further from Hội An. He never saw Cam again. Still, the watch stayed with him. Carried across the rest of his tour, carried across an ocean, carried all the way home to America, tucked away like it was waiting for something. Most soldiers came home from Vietnam and locked those memories away, too painful to revisit, too complicated to explain. But Phil's memory attached itself to one single face, one smile, one promise, left unfinished. Life after the war took Phil down a long road of service. He stayed in the military, 27 more years in uniform. Along the way, he earned a law degree, became a military prosecutor at the Pentagon, and eventually rose to chief prosecutor before retiring in 1995. He married a woman named Lynn. Together they built the kind of life so many veterans hope for: stability, achievement, respect. And through all of it, the career, the marriage, the decades, one small object stayed tucked away in a drawer: the watch. Most people would have forgotten by then. It was a child's casual request, made in broken English, in the middle of a war, 40 years in the past. Surely the boy had forgotten too. But Phil hadn't. For him, that promise had come to represent something much bigger than a watch. It was innocence in the middle of brutality, a bond of trust across a language, and a war that should have made trust impossible. A reminder that even in the darkest days, humanity still found a way to shine through. He used to tell himself, "I'll die with this watch in my drawer, never delivered, always unfinished." And that thought weighed on him more than he ever let on. Then, in the winter of 2007, fate offered him a chance. Friends of the family were planning a trip through Southeast Asia with a stop in Hội An. It had been over 4 decades since Phil had last set foot there. He knew the streets would be unrecognizable. The children he remembered would be grown, the town rebuilt entirely. Still, he felt he had to go. He packed his bags, slipped the watch inside, along with old photographs of Cam and his family. He carried no guarantees, only hope. When Phil arrived in Hội An, the town was alive in a completely different way than he remembered. Tourists filled the streets. Colorful lanterns glowed over the river at night. Markets spilled over with color and noise. But underneath the modern face of the town, Phil went looking for traces of the past. With the help of a local guide, he began asking around, showing old photos, describing a boy he had known briefly, 4 decades earlier. It seemed almost impossible. 40 years had passed. A boy of 9 would now be pushing 50. Who could possibly remember a detail that small, from that long ago? And yet, persistence paid off. One afternoon, the guide led Phil to a modest home on the edge of town. There they met a man, not Cam himself, but his younger brother. The brother listened quietly while the guide translated. Then, slowly, he nodded. Yes, he remembered. And yes, Cam was still alive. A meeting was arranged for the very next day. A man walked toward Phil, down the same streets he had once run through as a boy. He was no longer barefoot, no longer 9 years old. He was 49 now, a carpenter by trade, his hands rough from decades of work, his face marked by time in the way that only time can mark a face. It was Cam. At first he looked puzzled, almost wary. Who was this foreigner standing in front of him? Then the guide explained it all, piece by piece, that 40 years earlier, this man had been a young Marine, that he had known a boy named Cam, and that he had carried something for him, ever since, a watch. Cam's expression froze. His eyes widened. Slowly, the memory came flooding back. The soldiers who used to cross the river into town, the one who often carried a small dog on his back, the laughter, the kindness, the sense of adventure that somehow existed even in the middle of a war. The watch itself had faded from memory over the decades, but the man standing in front of him didn't feel like a stranger. Boo-hoo! Phil reached into his bag. His hands trembled as he pulled out the watch, worn, scratched, but still intact. Its ticking heart still alive, after everything. This is yours, he said simply. Cam stared at it. He shook his head, almost in disbelief, like his mind couldn't quite catch up to what was happening. At last, Phil pressed it into his palm. Boo-hoo! 2 men, once separated by war and by an entire ocean, wrapped their arms around each other. 40 years of distance, dissolved in a single embrace. If I had broken a promise to an adult, Phil explained later, I wouldn't have carried such regret. But to a child who never begged, who always smiled, who gave more than he took, that was different. The watch, it turned out, was never really about the watch. It was a bridge, and from that bridge, a whole new chapter began. Phil and Lynn grew close to Cam's family in the years that followed. When they learned that Cam's daughter, Vi, had left school because her family couldn't afford it, Lin quietly stepped in to help. 5 years later, in 2012, Phil and Lin returned to Vietnam once more, not for a reunion of old promises this time, but to celebrate something new. Vi was graduating from college. Phil and Lin bought plane tickets for Cam and his wife so they could fly to Ho Chi Minh City, once known as Saigon, and be there for their daughter's big day. It was Cam's very first time on an airplane. He brought gifts from his hometown, simple things, but full of love, and the families hosted a small party together in Vi's dormitory. In that room, laughter replaced whatever echoes of war might still have lingered between them. The watch had become something bigger than an object by then. It had become a symbol of friendship, of family, of two lives that turned out to be permanently intertwined, 40 years after a 9-year-old boy pointed at a soldier's wrist. Promises are fragile things. They're made in moments of hope, of innocence, sometimes without any real thought for the weight they'll carry later. And so often, they're broken, forgotten, buried under the years. But this story is proof that some promises survive. They linger. They tug quietly at the heart for decades, waiting for the day they're finally kept. For Phil Seymour, a simple promise to a 9-year-old boy came to define something essential about who he was. It was never really about the watch. It was about dignity, about respect, about the ability to look at a child in the middle of a war and see not an enemy, not a stranger, but a friend. When he finally placed that watch in Cam's hands, 40 years of quiet regret fell away, and in its place stood something stronger: connection. You fam! Today, Vi calls Phil and Lin often, not as a stranger speaking to distant benefactors, but as family. Two families, once separated by an ocean and a war neither of them chose, now linked across generations. A soldier, a boy, a watch, and a promise that proves, even in the shadow of war, kindness can outlast time itself.